Hey, what's going on, APUSH world? We have part one of a final exam review for you, 2014 edition. I'm going to cover everything today from Colonial America up to and including the Civil War. So this will be a bit of a video. I spent lots of time looking at frequently tested material, and I'm going to do my best to cover. I can virtually guarantee you a good portion of what is in this video will be at least on the multiple choice section of your test. So let's get going. All right, we're going to start off talking about Colonial America through 1776 through. It's important to note when we're talking about pre-colonial America that the first people to come to the Americas came from Asia through the Bering Strait. And the Bering Strait is located here. Here's a satellite image of it. You notice that it is underwater. And the Bering Strait used to connect North America and Russia and Asia. So that's how individuals came to North and South America. When we're talking about European colonization, it's important to know that the Spanish tended to settle in Central and South America. When you're thinking about this, guys, just simply think who speaks what languages and where. That'll help you figure out who settled in what areas. The French settled in New France, which was Canada and the Ohio Valley. That's why you have French speaking in Quebec. And Britain settled on the East Coast, what we know as the 13 colonies. And out of these three, the French tended to have the best relationships with the natives. They were the ones that were trading with them, the coureurs de bois, the beaver hunters. They had a very positive relationship where the British had kind of a hostile relationship with the natives. The Spanish did too to some degree, but they at least were able to intermarry and spread religion as well. But by far the French had the best. So let's focus on some colonial rebellions that you should know. Bacon's Rebellion, absolutely positively know this. This is from 1676. This is made up of poor landless whites that rebelled against Virginia Governor Berkeley. And they were upset with the lack of protection from Native Americans. These poor landless whites were living on the outskirts of Jamestown, and they were encroaching on Native American land. Now, it's very important to note when we're talking about Bacon's Rebellion that this leads to an increase in slavery. There is a movement away from indentured servants and a movement towards slaves, since slaves do not receive freedom. If you're writing an essay about the origins of slavery, you should absolutely talk about Bacon's Rebellion. Now, when we're talking about the Pueblo Revolt, this is a Native American revolt against the Spanish in present-day New Mexico, and they were successful in kicking out the Spanish for about a 10-year time period. The Stono Rebellion happens in 1739, and this is a rebellion in South Carolina near Charleston in which slaves killed many whites and they tried to flee the Spanish Florida. This is one of several slave rebellions that you will have to know. All right, let's focus on the British colony, since that is what most of American history is based on. When we're talking about Massachusetts Bay, we're talking about this guy, John Winthrop, who was a many-term governor, and this was established to a model society, or what he called a city upon a hill, and he envisioned that the whole world would look at Massachusetts Bay as a role model city for other cities throughout the world. And white land-owning church members could vote that had to be male, and women had very few rights in Massachusetts Bay. They were not religiously tolerant. This is very ironic because they moved to Massachusetts Bay to seek religious toleration, but they did not extend religious toleration to non-Puritans. This is seen in two very important people, Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Both of them challenged the clergy, and both of them were exiled from Massachusetts Bay, and both were exiled to Rhode Island, where Roger Williams was the founder. Now, Pennsylvania, this was founded by William Penn, who was a Quaker, and there is William Penn. Characteristics of Quakers that you should know: they were pacifists. Women had more rights. If you were ever asked about a question about which colony had the most rights for women, chances are it will be Pennsylvania, and they were very religiously tolerant. Much like Rhode Island, again founded by Roger Williams, they were religiously tolerant as well. Virginia, or Jamestown, was founded as a joint stock company in which members were seeking to achieve a profit, and tobacco helped improve the economy. They had a rough couple years to begin with, but once tobacco was introduced, they made lots of money. But this exhausted the land, and this helped lead to more expansion and eventually some conflict with Native Americans. Now, the First Great Awakening is something you should be familiar with. This is a religious revival And there are two people you should absolutely know. And John Edwards has appeared many times on released APUSH exams. Be familiar with him. He is the founder of the Great Awakening, and he is very famous for his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. If you ever see a quote about hell being hot or God being pissed off, chances are it's John Edwards from the First Great Awakening. So be able to recognize God, hell, etc. Now, George Whitefield, he was this guy from Europe. He was a great orator, and he would go around and preach as well. The British economic policy during colonial America was based on mercantilism, and the purpose of the colonies was to provide wealth for the mother country, and they do so by exporting more than they import. And the navigation laws were set up to enforce mercantilism, and this stated that the colonies could only trade with Britain. This was loosely enforced, though, until 1763. The French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, was the British and colonists versus the French and Native Americans. This absolutely, positively, drastically altered the relationship between the British and the colonists. In the past 10 years, there have been 3 separate essays on the impact of the French and Indian War, so do not sleep on this whatsoever. The reason why this alters the relationship is because Britain is in a lot of debt. And there's 4 major things from 1763 that you should be familiar with. The first is the end of the French and Indian War. The second is the end of salutary neglect, and Britain begins to take a more hands-on approach with the economy. Pontiac's Rebellion is a rebellion by Native Americans in what used to be the French land of the Ohio Valley, and they were upset about the British and the colonists. And this leads to the Proclamation Line of 1763, which was along the Appalachian Mountains, and it said the colonists could not expand west of that. And if you look at this map here, here are the 13 original colonies, and here is the Proclamation Line separating the red from the pink. So Britain in 1763 forbid expansion beyond this line. The Stamp Act was passed in 1765, and this was a major tax that was designed to raise revenue for the British. This leads to a colonial protest led by the Stamp Act Congress, and this was the first attempt at colonial unity against the British, and this was successful. The British overturned this mostly because of boycotts. Then we have the Declaratory Act, Townsend Acts, Intolerable Acts, and Tea Acts. These are different acts that are passed mostly to raise revenue. Again, after the French and Indian War, Britain is in debt and they begin taxing the colonies. The colonies are upset about this because they were okay with being taxed by their colonies, but not the British government. And you hear slogans like no taxation without representation. And this was the colonists' way of rejecting Britain's theory of virtual representation, saying that, you know what, even though you are not represented in Parliament by electing people, because you are a part of the British Empire, you are virtually represented in Parliament. The colonists did not like that. In 1776, we have an incredibly important writing, Common Sense, by Thomas Paine, or T-Paine as I like to call him, and he urged colonists to break away from England. He said it was common sense for them to do it, that it was insane for a larger body to be controlled by a smaller body. He also said that KG3, or King George III, was a bad dude, and the colonists should break away. This was instrumental in the Declaration of Independence. Now, some fighting occurs, but before the Declaration of Independence, we have the Olive Branch Petition, which is a last-ditch effort by the colonists at peace. And King George III says, absolutely not, you are in a state of rebellion, and I will crush you, and before you know it, the Revolutionary War breaks out. So let's focus on now the American Revolution through the Constitution. Absolutely know the Battle of Saratoga, and here is a picture of this painting that is in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. This is a turning point in the war because France now provides necessary aid to America, both in the forms of military and economic aid. Women during the war played a very important role. They helped provide food, money, medicine, etc. And in 1783, we have the Treaty of Paris, which ends the war, and it stated that the U.S. gained all land east of the Mississippi. So they essentially more than double the size from the original 13 colonies. Now, the first governing document of the United States was not the Constitution, it was the Articles of Confederation, and this was a very weak central government. They could not tax. You absolutely have to know that. They could not tax, they could not raise an army, and there was no executive branch. It's very important to know that most of this was left to the states, and they did that purposely because they did not like Britain and King George III. Shays' Rebellion happens in the 1780s, and this is instrumental in repealing the Articles of Confederation. You have Massachusetts farmers that rebelled, and this showed the need for a new, strong central government. So the government was too weak under the Articles to put this down quickly enough, so many people wanted a new, strong central government. There was one positive, or a few positives from the Articles of Confederation, and the one you should be familiar with is the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Territory is made up of these present-day states in black. And this outlawed slavery in this territory. This was the first congressional ban on slavery. And it also outlined how territories could become states. Once a territory hit a population of 60,000, they could apply to be a state. Very important to know the Northwest Land Ordinance. It does appear quite often, as does Shays' Rebellion. Holy cow, know both of those. Seriously, know them. If you don't know them, pause this, rewind it, watch it again. All right, the Constitutional Convention. Now, there is a need for a stronger central government, as we just talked about, and this is held in Philadelphia. There are a couple constitutional compromises that you should know, and we will begin by talking about the Great Compromise, which is also known as the Connecticut Compromise. Now, this is a combination of two plans, the Virginia plan, which favored large states, and the New Jersey plan, which favored small states. What this did was create a bicameral, and that word bicameral means a two-house legislature, in which one house is based on population, that's the House of Representatives, and one house has equal representation, that is the Senate. So small states like this because they're equally represented in the Senate, and big states like this because they have more of an advantage in the House. And this helps settle disputes or issues over representation in Congress. Now, another compromise is the 3/5 Compromise, which dealt with the issue of representation for slaves. In this state, the 3 out of 5 slaves would count towards population for representation in the House. So the South is able to count at least some of their slaves towards population. And it's important to note that both of these, population is determined based on a census every 10 years. Now, after the Constitution is written, there's a couple things that are created to gain support for the Constitution. The first one is the Federalist Papers. This is written by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, this guy here, and James Madison. And this was a series of articles written to gain support for the ratification of the Constitution. What ultimately helps propel the Constitution to be ratified was the Bill of Rights. And this was the first 10 amendments, and this was added to the Constitution to appease the Anti-Federalists. Once these Anti-Federalists were promised a Bill of Rights, you see 5 states pretty much immediately ratify the Constitution. And eventually this leads to enough states ratifying the Constitution, and a short time later you have all 10 amendments are added at once. All right, we're going to focus on George Washington to John Adams. The Judiciary Act of 1789 created the Supreme Court with 5 associate judges and 1 chief justice, and this chief justice is John Jay. So originally the Supreme Court had 6 people. Alexander Hamilton had a financial plan to help with a country that was in lots of debt. The purpose was to improve the economy, and he wanted to do this by creating a Bank of the United States. He also wanted to create tariffs on imported goods and excise taxes, which are taxes on manufactured goods. The excise tax leads directly to this event, the Whiskey Rebellion in 1791. So we have farmers in Pennsylvania who are upset over this tax on whiskey, so they begin to rebel. Now keep in mind, the last time we saw a rebellion was Shays' Rebellion, and that dragged out for a very long time. Well, the Whiskey Rebellion is quickly crushed by George Washington. Actually, Alexander Hamilton is there with him as well. And this demonstrates the power of the new federal government. So it's important, I'm going to go back and compare the Whiskey Rebellion with Shays' Rebellion again. The Shays' Rebellion showed that there was a weakness in the Articles of Confederation, and the Whiskey Rebellion showed that the new central government under the Constitution was strong. It's very important to know that. Washington's farewell address was not really an address, but rather a letter in a paper, and he warned against foreign alliances, and this will help promote neutrality not only in the immediate years, but for a very, very long time, really up until World War II. And if you think about World War I, afterwards with the Treaty of Versailles, you have people like Henry Cabot Lodge who are against the Treaty of Versailles. And a lot of this goes back to Washington's farewell address of avoiding entangling alliances. The XYZ affair occurred under John Adams' administration, and 3 U.S. diplomats led by future Chief Justice John Marshall went to France to hope to meet with a French minister. Now, France was a little upset with the United States, so 3 French agents, nicknamed X, Y, and Z, approached them and asked the 3 U.S. diplomats to pay $250,000 to meet with the French diplomat, and the U.S. refuses. This leads to a quasi-war and also the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts in the United States. So what's the purpose of the Alien and Sedition Acts? This is a very important point to know for multiple choice questions. Federalists, led by John Adams, wanted to silence their opponents. Now, their opponents at this time are the Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonians, and they tended to be very pro-French. So the Alien Act, let's deal with that one first. This made it more difficult for foreigners to become U.S. citizens. It changed the waiting period from 5 to 14 years before they could become a citizen. Now the Sedition Act, we'll see another Sedition Act later in 1917. This made it illegal to criticize the government, specifically the Federalist or President Adams. Now clearly this is a violation of the Constitution in the First Amendment, but there is no judicial review yet. That will come later. So the Alien Sedition Acts leads directly to these 2 men, Jefferson and Madison, writing the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Kentucky was written anonymously by Jefferson, who was a sitting VP. When else has a sitting VP written something criticizing the government? Oh, we'll find out very soon. And Virginia was written by Madison. They encouraged states to nullify the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. None do, but this will establish this idea of nullification. All right, Jefferson becomes president in 1800, which is known as the Revolution of 1800 because this is a peaceful transition of power from Federalists to Democratic Republicans. This is the first time we have a transition of political parties. Before he becomes president, the Federalist Congress creates the Judiciary Act of 1801, which appoints new judges and allows the president to appoint these judges, the outgoing president, John Adams. So he appoints many in his last couple days, and these are called midnight judges because he does it even in the last day of office. This leads to arguably the most important court case in U.S. history, Marbury versus Madison. So it's important to know that the Supreme Court declared part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional. I do have a whole video on Marbury versus Madison. Check it out in the description along with every single other video I've ever done that relates to this time period. There's probably going to be like 80 of them down there. But anything you want more detail on, check those videos first. This is the first time that the Supreme Court declared a law unconstitutional. That's very important to know, and John Marshall is the Chief Justice. So now this gives the judicial branch lots of power in the United States government. Also in 1803, we have the Louisiana Purchase. This was purchased from France all because the U.S. wanted the port of New Orleans for trade. This doubles the size of the United States, and Jefferson, who used to strictly interpret the Constitution when he was against the Bank of the United States, now begins to loosely interpret it because nowhere in the Constitution does it say the president could buy land. So he switches from strict to loose. And all this area in white is what the U.S. gains from the Louisiana Purchase. In 1807, things are heating up, particularly with Great Britain, and this leads to the Embargo Act of 1807. Which cut off all trade between the U.S. and every other country on this planet. This was a huge disaster, especially in New England, which a lot of individuals were merchants and their economy was based on trade. But there was one small positive in that this helped start the American Industrial Revolution. So Thomas Jefferson, even though he was a big agrarian or farmer guy, he actually helped start the American Industrial Revolution. The War of 1812 happened shortly after, and some causes that you should be familiar with include impressment or British kidnapping American sailors. The British were also arming Native Americans, particularly out west, and there were war hawks as well, led by none other than Henry Clay. So the U.S. goes to war. They try to gain Canada. They envisioned that Canada would welcome them with open arms. It was a huge disaster. But the war does produce 2 war heroes. The first is William Henry Harrison from the Battle of Tippecanoe. And when he runs for president in 1840, he runs on the slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And the other is Andrew Jackson. And you can see him here. He is the hero from the Battle of New Orleans, which actually happens 2 weeks after the war ends. But because it took so long for info to get there, the U.S. and Britain were fighting. And this absolutely helps propel Jackson to the presidency in 1828. So if you ever see a question, and there have been some about what made Jackson so popular to become president, or what was the leading cause of him being president, it's because he was a war hero from the War of 1812, just like William Henry Harrison. Now, it's important to talk about the Hartford Convention. This happens in December of 1814 while the war is still going on. It's almost over, though. This was grievances of several Federalists in New England. They wanted to alter the Constitution. They were really upset with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, with the embargoes and Madison going to war, and they proposed different amendments, including raising the requirements to go to war to 2/3 of Congress instead of more than 1/2, and also for an embargo, they wanted 2/3 of Congress to agree on that as well. And this helped lead to the demise of the Federalist Party, because the nation is experiencing this huge sense of nationalism in the Federalist Party, or at least these members of the Federalist Party, look like a bunch of spoiled brats. And this leads directly to the era of good feelings. And this is during James Monroe's presidency from 1816 to 1824. And it's called the era of good feelings. It was coined by a Boston newspaper. This is a time of one political party, the Democratic Republicans. Again, the Federalists are essentially dead. You have an increase in nationalism, and you also are introduced to a wonderful congressman by the name of Henry Clay and his American system. And there are 3 parts of his American system that you should know. And he favored the Bank of the United States. By this time, it's the second one. He really focused on internal improvements, or improving roads within the country, roads and canals, to improve the transportation system. And one way that it would be paid for is by a protective tariff in 1816. So previous tariffs to this point were meant just to raise revenue for the government. This 1816 tariff is so high to protect American industry and help encourage American industry. There's good old Hank, or Henry. In 1820, we have the Missouri Compromise, which is Henry Clay's first compromise. Missouri applied for statehood, which was the first state from the Louisiana Purchase territory, and this would upset the balance of free and slave states. So there's 3 parts that you should know. Missouri here in yellow is added as a slave state. Maine up here in orange is added as a free state. Then we have this 3630 line right here just below Missouri. Everything above this in the Louisiana Territory would be free in the future. Everything below this would be slave in the future. So this helps settle, at least temporarily, the issue of slavery in states. One of the last things Monroe does during his presidency is the Monroe Doctrine from 1823, and this is actually written by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. And he tells European countries, you stay over there, you are completely different politically than we are in America, and you are not allowed to recolonize any areas of Latin America. Keep in mind there are lots of rebellions in Latin America, and countries are declaring their independence. So Monroe was worried about Europe getting all up in the business of these Latin American countries, so he says, you stay over there, and we'll stay over here. And the U.S. will stay out of European affairs. This becomes a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy for decades throughout the 19th century. All right, we're going to go to the Jacksonian Era. This is my favorite time period. This is Jackson, Clay, 2 enormously important figures in American history, and they hate each other. It's fantastic. What more could you ask for? And the Jacksonian Era tends to span from 1824 to 1840, even though Jackson doesn't become president until 1828. It all starts with a corrupt bargain of 1824. There's no electoral majority in the election of 1824, although Jackson got the most popular votes and electoral votes, but he did not get an electoral majority. So according to the 12th Amendment, the vote now goes to Congress, the House of Representatives. And Clay, who is the Speaker of the House, throws his support behind John Quincy Adams, I should say. Adams becomes president, and he names Clay his Secretary of State. And you can see here that these states that were yellow voted for Henry Clay in the election, and they switched their allegiance to John Quincy Adams. Under the House rules of the 12th Amendment, each state gets 1 vote. That makes Andrew Jackson furious, and he and his supporters call it a corrupt bargain. Now, when Jackson becomes president in 1828, this time period is known as the Common Man. And it's because we see an increase in voting rights for adult males, and also the elimination of property requirements to vote. So no longer do you have to be rich and white in order to vote, you just have to be a white male. So we're slowly making progress towards including more Americans. In 1828, we have the Tariff of Abominations. This was a very high tariff. This is hated by the South and the West because there's not a lot of industry there. They're consumers, so now they have to pay more for goods. And John C. Calhoun, who is the sitting vice president, drew inspiration from Thomas Jefferson, and he wrote something called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, and he wrote this anonymously. It's the same idea as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. So what do you think he urged states to do? If you said nullify, you were absolutely correct. He urged states to nullify the Tariff of Abominations. Much like the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, no states followed along. We're going to flash forward 4 years later with the Tariff of 1832. It lowers the tariff a little bit from 1828, but it's still way too high for the South's liking. So now Calhoun is really upset. South Carolina is really upset. So they call a convention and they actually nullify the Tariff of 1832. And this leads to the nullification crisis. So South Carolina calls a convention and they nullify the Tariff of 1832, as I said. And they also told Jackson, by the way, if you or the military, anybody comes down here and tries to collect the tariffs by force, we will secede, we will break away. And this panics a lot of people. So this leads to a compromise tariff of 1833 led by none other than Henry Clay. And there is Super Clay with his cape on. I drew that. No, I didn't. My wife did. I couldn't do that in a million years if I tried. And this lowered the tariff rates by 10% per year for 8 years. And this makes the South happy because they have a lower tariff. It makes the North happy because it lowers it gradually. All right, continuing with the Jacksonian Era, we're going to focus on Jackson and Native Americans. During his administration, you see the Indian Removal Act occur. And the purpose of this was to move natives west of the Mississippi River. The Supreme Court, led by John Marshall, ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that natives did not have to move. And this is supposedly where Andrew Jackson said, John Marshall's made his decision, now let him enforce it. So Jackson did not enforce the Supreme Court's decision, and ultimately the Native Americans are forced to move. So Andrew Jackson violates the idea of checks and balances and does not enforce a Supreme Court decision, which is what he was supposed to do. The bank war is a very important thing that appears often as well in the multiple choice section. In 1832, prior to the election of 1832, Henry Clay, who was running for the Whigs, proposes a third bust that would begin in 1836 because the second bust, or the second Bank of the United States, would expire in 1836. So he wants to propose this knowing that Jackson would veto it, and Clay envisioned that Americans would then not vote for Andrew Jackson. So, of course, Andrew Jackson vetoes the recharter, and there's Nicholas Biddle, by the way. He is the president of the second bus and buddies with Henry Clay. And the third bus is vetoed, but the second bus still had 4 more years. So Andrew Jackson wants to kill it. He felt that too much power was in the hands of men like Nicholas Biddle. So he wanted to destroy the second bus, so he removed all the government funds and put them into state or pet banks. So this is ultimately how he kills the bus. So again, why did he dislike this? Definitely know this. He felt it benefited the rich or the elite. This has appeared as a multiple choice question quite often. And again, he felt that too much power was concentrated in the hands of a few people, in this case, Nicholas Biddle. All right, Texas declares independence while Andrew Jackson is president, but he does not recognize independence because he is afraid of the issue of slavery and the expansion in sectional tensions over slavery. Many people were clamoring for Texas to join the United States. In 1840, this signifies the end of the Jacksonian Era. We had the election of 1840, which produced a lot of slogans. William Henry Harrison, the War of 1812 hero, is running against former Jackson Vice President Martin Van Buren and the incumbent president, because he was president in the election of 1836. And this is an incredibly high voter turnout. Another thing to know about the Jacksonian Era is you have a very high voter turnout. And slogans were used in this election, including log cabins and hard cider, and Tippecanoe and Tyler too as well. So to understand the Civil War, we really have to understand manifest destiny, as this is a major cause of the Civil War. So what is it? And definitely know this picture. It is a term coined by John Sullivan, And it's this belief that is America's God-given right to expand from coast to coast. So you see people here moving to the left in the picture or to the west, and you have this angel floating above them. So it's America's right to expand to the west. And you see railroads starting over here. They're not all the way over here yet. That'll come in time. The Transcontinental Railroad is not built. You see boats in the background, farmers down here expanding, people with their Conestoga wagons, and you see Native Americans looking back and fleeing as well. So this is a very, very important political cartoon or painting to know. The Mexican-American War happens during James Polk's presidency, and he beats Henry Clay in 1844. Polk claimed that Americans were attacked on American soil. By this time, they're in Texas, which had just joined the Union, but there was some disputed territory in Texas. So during the war, you have a very famous guy, Henry David Thoreau. He writes this essay on civil disobedience, and he was inspired. He was so upset with the Mexican-American War, he refused to pay a poll tax that he believed would fund the war. Now, ironically, the poll tax had nothing to do with the war, but he refused to pay, and he spent some time in jail, and he wrote this essay on civil disobedience. This will go on to inspire two very important people in world history, Gandhi and Martin Luther King. The Wilmot Proviso is never passed, but is proposed several times in Congress during the Mexican-American War, and it stated that any land gained from the Mexican cession should have no slavery in it whatsoever. And this is never passed in the Senate, where the South had equal representation, but it is in fact passed in the House. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the Mexican-American War, and the U.S. gained the Mexican cession and increased its size by 1/3. The Compromise of 1850 deals with the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, and this helps settle the dispute over this land gained from the war. So it includes several parts, including popular sovereignty in the Mexican cession, a tough fugitive slave law, which inadvertently turns many in the North to the abolitionist cause and helps fuel fire for the Civil War. It abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C., not slavery, but the slave trade, and California was also admitted as a free state. And this finally tips the balance in favor of free states, 16-15. And also, Texas was claiming some territory that the U.S. said did not belong to them, so the way they settled this was by throwing some cash to Texas. Now, we'll finish up with manifest destiny with the Gadsden Purchase. It's this little area of land in yellow down here in New Mexico and Arizona. And this is what completes continental expansion of the United States. So our present day continental boundaries are complete with the Gadsden Purchase. This is purchased due to the fact that the U.S. wanted to build a transcontinental railroad going through the South. And this is my little spiel where I've said many times, if you've watched some of my videos, I'll tell you to go watch Jimmy Fallon in the Gadsden Purchase. It's very funny and deals with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo as well. Go watch it. Take a break for 5 minutes. Come back. I'll be here doing more. All right, we're going to talk about some reform movements prior to the Civil War. By the way, Antebellum means pre-Civil War. Second Great Awakening occurs because you can't just have one, you got to have two. And the Burned Over District is an area of my hometown of Buffalo, New York, this burned over area of Western New York, which saw many religious conversions. There were some of the highest conversion rates in the entire country. And the Second Great Awakening was a belief in perfectionism, and many individuals sought to reform society. So some key reform movements that are born out of the Second Great Awakening include the abolitionist movement. Obviously, that is meant to abolish slavery. Temperance movement, which sought to eliminate alcohol, and women's rights. And you see this at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, this declaration of sentiments in which women are asking for the right to vote. It's important to know with these three movements, women played a major role in all three of these movements. When we're talking about education, you have to remember Horace Mann, who promoted education, and treatment for the mentally ill improved during this time thanks to Dorothy Dix. She went around and advocated for those with mental illness. Some notable religions that you should be familiar with during this time include the Mormons. They actually flee to Utah where they set up shop because they are persecuted in the East. Shakers are founded by Mother Ann Lee. They are celibate, so it's the one religion that you cannot be born into. You have to choose to be converted. And we also have this idea of transcendentalism. And this is a movement to find one's inner self and kind of become one with nature as well. Henry David Thoreau, I mentioned earlier, in addition to writing on civil disobedience, he also wrote a very important book called Walden, where he lived in isolation for 2 years in Walden Pond, and he wrote about his experience with that. Ralph Waldo Emerson also wrote a very famous book called Self-Reliance, and these are two examples of transcendentalism. So if you ever see a quote and it has the words self-reliance in it or relying on yourself, chances are it's Ralph Waldo Emerson. Prior to the Civil War, we have old immigration, and we can't talk about old immigration without talking about nativism. This is something that is throughout American history even today. Nativism is fear, distrust, and hatred of foreigners. So why is there nativism? Well, different cultures, different languages, and different religions as well really separate some of these immigrants from quote-unquote Americans living in America. When we're talking about old immigration, we're talking mostly about Irish and Germans, and they were accused also of stealing elections. They tended to vote Democratic, especially under the influence of Tammany Hall in New York City. Immigrants were also accused of taking jobs because they would often work for less money. And these are really going to be the same arguments as new immigrants when we get to post-Civil War, 1880 to 1920. It's just a different group of people, but the same exact reasons. The Know Nothing Party is formed as a response to immigration, and this is an example of nativism, and they originated as the name was the Supreme Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, and they wanted to ban Catholics from holding offices, and most Irish tended to be Catholics. So this was a very anti-Irish political party. They also called for tougher immigration and naturalization laws. Now, going back to what exactly old immigration is, these are immigrants that came from Northern and Western Europe. Definitely know Northern and Western Europe. And one way I remember this is if you think about the Northwest Territory or the old Northwest Territory, I think of old immigration they came from Northern and Western Europe. So what specific countries? Ireland in particular because of the potato famine, Germany and England as well. If you're asked which country made up the largest amount, hands down it'll be Ireland every single time. So when does this occur? It's between the 1820s and 1870s, basically up until the Civil War. And again, what group made up the largest group of immigrants prior to the Civil War? No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It is the Irish. All right, we're going to focus on slavery, and slave life was horrific. No matter how bad you think it was, multiply it by 1,000, that's how bad it is. At least that's the start of how bad it is. Slaves worked long hours. They did incredibly arduous hard work, and as a general rule of thumb, the further south you went in the country, the more there were slaves and the harder the work was. Think about just climate as well. Working in Kentucky, which has slaves, the climate in Kentucky is a lot cooler than it would be in Mississippi or Alabama. Slave codes were laws to regulate slave life, and they stated things like slaves could not read or write. That's why 90% of African Americans were illiterate at the end of the Civil War. But we also see a very unique culture develop as a result of slave life that is a combination of African and American cultures. And you see this in religion. And you also see a unique extended family that develops to watch over slaves when families are broken up. So some slave rebellions that you should definitely know. We talked about the Stono Rebellion earlier. Denmark Vesey planned a rebellion somewhere around 1820. He planned the largest ever revolt. This does not occur because it was found out in advance. Nat Turner, this rebellion occurs in 1831, and here is a piece of propaganda depicting this, and you can see that these poor, according to this piece of propaganda, these poor innocent whites are being butchered by these slaves. This happens in Virginia. 60 whites and 100 blacks were killed, and this coincided in the same year with William Lloyd Garrison's publication of the newspaper, The Liberator, and this scared many people in the South. So you have this abolitionist newspaper and this rebellion, and many people in the South were afraid of future slave rebellions and slavery being eliminated. In Virginia in particular, Nat Turner's rebellion helped silence the abolitionist movement, and every single rebellion, slave rebellion, will lead to more strict laws on slaves. Although slave rebellions did happen, this is important to know for multiple choice, the most common form of resistance was not rebellions. They did happen, but they were rare. Rather, it was running away, faking sickness, working slowly, and or breaking tools. So if you're asked, which of the following is the most common form of resistance, go with something that is more passive, like running away, faking sickness, etc. The gag resolution deals with the House of Representatives throughout the 1830s and 40s, and this prohibited any anti-slavery petition in the House of Representatives. So if a member of the House wanted to propose eliminating slavery, that petition could not even be brought to discussion. It would automatically be what's called tabled. This is eventually repealed thanks to the help of this guy, John Quincy Adams, who was a member of the House after he was president. And there he is later in life. Look at the sideburns on that guy, huh? Those are sweet mutton chops. All right, continuing with slavery, in 1850 we have the Fugitive Slave Law, which was a part of the Compromise of 1850. This was a much tougher law, and many in the North now joined the abolitionist movement. Many states in the North passed personal liberty laws, which are essentially nullification. They're urging states to not enforce the fugitive slave law. And that's going to upset the South because the South is arguing that nullification is not allowed. They couldn't do it earlier, so why is the North doing it now? Some abolitionist writings you should absolutely know. The Liberator by William Lloyd Garrison. This was a weekly newspaper published from 1831 to 1865. The dude never missed a single weekly edition. It was very, very influential. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It depicted the horrors of slavery, especially the breakup of slave families. Some abolitionists that you should know. I'm going to throw a group at you, the American Colonization Society, which has been asked before. This group sought to send slaves back to Africa once they became free. William Lloyd Garrison, again with the Liberator. Frederick Douglass, this former slave who was self-educated. He wrote several writings, including the North Star. He was arguably the most famous abolitionist. Harriet Beecher Stowe, again, Uncle Tom's Cabin, definitely know these people. Harriet Tubman was an influential person on the Underground Railroad. She helped over 300 slaves escape from the South to Canada, even went back and rescued her parents. She went back several times, endangering her life to help slaves. John Brown, he tries to start a rebellion at Harper's Ferry in Virginia, which is now in present-day West Virginia, and that is an immediate cause of the Civil War. The Free Soil Party was formed in the 1840s. They were against the spread of slavery into Western territory, so they would favor that Wilmot Proviso from the Mexican-American War, which would ban all slavery from Western territories. George Fitzhugh, be able to recognize this guy. He was from the South. I have seen quotes on him before. He argued that Northern workers were worse off than slaves. So if you ever see George Fitzhugh, he is a supporter of slavery in the South, and he is an apologist for slavery. So just be able to recognize this guy. He's pro-slavery, and he would argue that Northern workers are worse off than slaves. All right, the road to Civil War. In 1854, we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was proposed by this guy, Stephen Douglas, and he wanted to introduce popular sovereignty into these two new territories of Kansas and Nebraska. This would overturn the Missouri Compromise because both of those territories were over that 3630 line. So voting in Kansas, which was expected that it would join as a slave state, turned very bloody. This is where you have even John Brown and his sons going out there, and they start this, what's known as Bleeding Kansas. I have a very detailed video in the description below on that as well. Around the same time, we have the caning of Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner is an abolitionist senator from the North, and he is caned by a young House of Representative member from South Carolina. And so even in Congress, fighting is breaking out over the issue of slavery. Now, Bleeding Kansas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act helped inspire the Republican Party. Their platform, the Republican Party's platform, would be to stop the spread of slavery. It was not to eliminate it. So when Lincoln ran in 1860, it was not to eliminate slavery, but rather it was to stop the spread of slavery. In 1857, we have Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was a slave. And the Supreme Court, and probably its worst decision ever, made several very significant decisions. One, Supreme Court stated that African Americans were not citizens, whether they were slaves or not. So over 4 million Americans who were of African descent are not citizens. They also said that slavery is constitutional and that Congress had no right to legislate slavery in territories. Northerners were furious, and the Democratic Party is split along sectional lines. Even Stephen Douglas, who is a Democrat, was upset with this. He believed very much in popular sovereignty. So what you see is that Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats will unite around different people. In 1859, here's a picture of Harper's Ferry. This is the area that John Brown took over. It was an armory, the second largest armory in the United States, and he planned an uprising to free slaves. This was a huge failure. He envisioned many slaves running from their plantations, coming to Harper's Ferry and starting this massive rebellion. It never, ever happened. Many Southerners, though, were very fearful that there would be many more John Browns, and this was an immediate cause of the Civil War. And many Southerners also associated the Republican Party with John Brown, even though the Republican Party did distance themselves from John Brown. All right, talking about the Civil War. The election of 1860, this is where Abe Lincoln becomes president. And you'll notice that he does not win a single state or single electoral vote in the South, and he becomes president anyway. That upsets the South because they feel, why should we be a part of this country if a president is elected without our say? This is the immediate cause of the Civil War. This is the most important short-term immediate cause of the Civil War. Lincoln campaigned on the non-extension of slavery. He did not campaign on eliminating slavery. I'm going to repeat that again because it's important. He did not want to eliminate slavery in his campaign. He simply said, we are not going to allow it to expand. So wherever slavery is, it can stay, but it's not going to expand. So the war itself, some things you should be familiar with. The term conscription is a draft or a forced enlistment. Although substitutes could be hired for people that were drafted. If you had, I believe it was $300, you could pay for a substitute to go in your place. This led to the New York City draft riots in 1863. And the Civil War is often called a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, because if you were rich, you could pay somebody to take your place. And at these New York City draft riots, hundreds of people were killed. Contraband is a term that is used for escaped slaves that crossed over to the Union and fought on their behalf against the South. And they would often work at camps and fought in the war as well. Border states you should be familiar with. These were slave states that did not secede during the Civil War, that they in fact remained a part of the Union, and they played a very important part. Border states included Missouri, West Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, and Kentucky. The Battle of Antietam is the single bloodiest day in U.S. history. The North won, and this led Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And this also helped keep European countries out of the war. So this is a turning point in the war that you should be familiar with. Habeas corpus guarantees you the right to have a trial if you are brought up on charges, but Lincoln suspends this during the Civil War. So you see, during times of war, times of crisis, individual rights go down. And this is important to note that only Congress can suspend habeas corpus, not the president, but Lincoln does it anyway. All right, some miscellaneous pre-Civil War stuff that we will wrap up with. Key ideas for women. Definitely no Republican motherhood. That really begins post-Revolutionary War. This is the belief that women should raise children to be good citizens. And this kind of goes along with the idea of the cult of domesticity. In this state, that women had separate spheres than men. Their place belonged in the home, raising a family. And this really helped reinforce different roles for men and women throughout American history. The Hudson River School is a school that painted landscapes and environment. If you get stuck on this, just remember Hudson River is an environmental thing. It's a river, so think that they painted landscapes and the environment. When you think about John Marshall in the Supreme Court, he tended to favor the federal government over states, and the Supreme Court also made decisions that would promote business. Daniel Webster gave what's known as the second reply to Hayne during the nullification crisis. And this is a debate in Congress over sectionalism, and Webster promoted national unity. So if you see Daniel Webster in his reply to Hayne, think national unity. And there he is giving his reply. All right, that is hopefully everything you need to know from Colonial America up to and including the Civil War. I hope I was able to clarify many things for you. If you guys have any questions or concerns, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Please spread this video with as many people as possible. I really truly want to help as many people for this APUSH exam as I can. So if you know anybody who would benefit from this, please share this with them. And again, if you have any questions or comments for me, let me know. Look for a future video that will deal with from Reconstruction up to present day. That should be out in a couple weeks, definitely in time for your exam in May. I appreciate you guys watching. Best of luck to you in May. You will do awesome. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.